Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Our Connections webinar. Give everyone a minute here to log in and get settled. And then we'll get our webinar started with Dr. Sung. Again, welcome. Productive Frictions in Video Game Design webinar for Our Connections here at the end of June. Dr. Sung is joining us. Just let everyone arrive here and get started in just a moment. Great, we'll just give everyone one more minute and then we'll jump right into the content today about video game design. All right, we'll go ahead and get started to be respectful of everyone's time. Good afternoon, Amy Garrettson, Director of Constituent Engagement in class of 2004 here from joining you from Smith Hall on a beautiful campus today. We're excited to have Dr. Sung with us today. He's going to talk about productive friction in video game design. I didn't practice that one enough. We're going to hear a little bit about his work. Dr. Sung recently completed his PhD in computer sciences and education at UW-Madison. And the topic of his dissertation was video game design. And he's been teaching on campus here in computer and data science courses, things like introduction to programming and video game development to our students. And he's going into his second year. Is that right, Dr. Sung? Second year?
Actually going into my third year now.
Third year, right? Okay,
Yeah.
That's what I thought. And so outside of work, he listens to a lot of podcasts, produces his own music, and obviously designs video games, not just for work, but also for fun. And so we're super excited to have you here, Dr. Sung, and talk to us a little bit about your work and your research and your work with our students. So I'll let you kind of take over from here. Again, if you have any questions for Dr. Sung, you can put those right in the chat feature, or the Q&A feature actually is better, to let us know what questions you have, and we'll get some information about the video game design, and then we'll have a little bit of Q&A time and discussion.
Yeah, all right. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. So as mentioned, I'll be talking about my dissertation work called Productive Frictions in Game Design. So let me just get that up and running. So yeah, this is a brief outline just to show you what we're going to go through. But that really doesn't matter too much. I'll just be kind of giving you the highlights of my dissertation work. And the motivating questions and like the basic things that we want to talk about are, how can video games be educational? So first of all, like, are video games educational, and in what ways are they? And then how can frictions, either in the form of challenges or obstacles in the games, lead to learning? So those are our guiding questions throughout this talk. And to address the first question, video games can be thought of as being learning machines when you think about it, because first of all, good video games always provide challenges that meet the players at the edge of their comfort zone. And that overlaps with a lot of educational philosophy, in where you want to challenge students to the edge of their abilities, because that's where they're going to start learning new things. So for example, games like Halo and Overcooked and lots of other games in different genres, they provide constantly evolving challenges that push you and push your abilities to the next level. So for example, in the screenshot of Overcooked 2, they start adding more and more difficult challenges as you're trying to play the game to push your limits. And that's also a good thing to have when you're trying to learn something. Another aspect of video games that allow you to think of them as learning machines is that games provide a natural cycle where you can practice your skills to get better at them repeatedly until you can master them. But then video games will also throw a wrench into that cycle, where you have to rethink how you're doing something so that you learn a new skill. So the failure that you meet in a video game should usually push you towards learning a new skill so that you can continue to progress in whatever thing it is that you're trying to get better at. So an example is a game called Celeste, which is notoriously a difficult platformer game where you have to jump around and move through the puzzles. And as it gets harder and harder, you have to learn how to combine your skills and your mechanics in different ways to complete the levels. So another aspect of video games is that if you've noticed in a lot of modern video games is that they teach you how to play the game as you play the game itself. So if you think about it, when is the last time that you really had to read a manual in order to learn how to play a video game? Unless it's like a really, really old video game from decades ago, chances are you don't really ever pick up a manual to learn how to play a video game. You just play the game. And then the levels, there's usually some sort of tutorial level that's built in that teaches you how to play the game as you go. So for example, here's a popular mobile video game called Angry Birds. And in the first level, it teaches you how to play the game. So notice the hand icon. And there are little guiding arrows that show you where you should aim. And then as you progress and as the game introduces new concepts, it pops up with little things that tells you what's going on. And as the player continues, as it introduces a new concept, it pauses and it tells you what to do. For example, here it tells you to tap on the screen to activate an ability. So the good games will have these built-in tutorials that teach you how to play the game as you go. So it's a lot more motivating as a learner when you're learning through experience and not just through reading a manual per se.
Yeah, and it seems to be right. I think that's what I was just thinking is it's kind of how you naturally want to learn something or you want to teach someone something is you teach by doing or showing. And so instead of reading instructions and trying to figure out how to really make it work, you're not building something or, having to put a piece of furniture together. You really just want to practice, right? And then you're going to intuitively get better at it.
Yeah, so games are the perfect example of learning by doing, and they're just naturally made to do that. And so if you are able to harness that power in the right way, you can create lots of really interactive and motivating educational games. So
they're not just for fun is what the lesson I'm learning is.
Right.
Especially for parents is they might not just they're playing and yes, they're having fun, but they're actually learning something while they're doing it, which is pretty important.
And the best games are educational, whether they mean to be or not. Depending on like what they're teaching you, that differs. But the best games teach you how to play the game, at least at the base core level. It should be a good teaching tool for how to play the game. So all the best games are learning tools in that sense. So moving on to the next point is something called design frictions. So that was the main topic of my dissertation, which is there are points of difficulty that are encountered during a user's interaction with the technology. So when described in that way, they're usually viewed as being negative in terms of user experience. But there are some that make the case that certain design frictions in a piece of software or in a piece of interaction could have a positive outcome, including learning. So why would we want to study design frictions? So when I talk about frictions, I mean anything from like a big challenge or an obstacle in the way, or it could be something as simple as having too many buttons that you have to click through to get to the right menu item that you want to find to do something in the game. So why do we want to study this? There's lots of different angles. There's a researcher perspective, there's the educational perspective, and there's also the commercial game designer perspective. So those are all valid reasons to want to study this. So basically the way we're going to define productive friction in our case is that it's an obstacle or impasse that impedes the player's ability to accomplish a task in a game by sacrificing usability. So when we say usability, it just means like your ability to take an action in the game as easily as possible. So by making something harder to do in a game, you can actually promote productive learning outcomes by challenging them to overcome the obstacle. So if you think about it in terms of learning, this makes natural sense because having a challenge, having a challenging task is how we can sometimes motivate students to learn a new skill in order to overcome that obstacle. So when we think about obstacles and obstructions as friction, that's like one of the most common things that you can find in a game, because if you want to have a meaningful game, you need to have some sort of obstructions in the game that the player has to overcome. So for example, I have a picture of a Goomba here. So if you're playing Mario, if you're familiar with Mario, these Goombas are obstructions to your gameplay that you want to reach the end of the level. But these obstructions also provide ways for you to get better at the game by learning how to time your jumps and things like that. The interesting thing is there's a study by Barr and Collett that also found that obstructions can prompt learning in games, especially in like tutorial levels and when there's specific mechanics that are tied to those obstructions. So obstructions can be a form of friction that we can use to prompt learning. Another way to think about obstructions is to view them as something called microboundaries, which are something that promote system two thinking. So in terms of system two thinking and system one thinking, you can basically just think of this as system one thinking is your like intuitive, automatic, quick thinking that you do without any conscious thought. So a lot of times when you're playing a game, you might just be doing something intuitively if you're already familiar with the game. However, system two thinking is the slow or calculated thinking where you have to use your conscious like thoughts and actually think about something before taking an action. So when we want to design an educational game, we probably want to promote reflective and conscious thoughts so that players know what they're doing and actually learn from something that they're doing. So what we want to do is provide micro boundaries, these opportunities for players to slow down and think about what they're doing so that they can improve their gameplay, improve whatever it is that they're trying to learn. So we want to move them from system one thinking to system two thinking. So that's a goal for having obstructions. Another type of friction that I studied was something called juice or juiciness, which is just a label for, it's a funny word to talk about in the context of games, but it's basically the label that we give certain types of special effects in video games. So if you compare these two versions of a breakout game, the left side we call dry, meaning there's no extra special effects in the game, whereas the right-hand side has all these added colors, particle explosions, animation effects that make the game more appealing, and there's lots of positive feedback built into the game. So when we have this juicy version, players tend to gravitate towards a game that's juicier because they like to see those kinds of effects and that feedback in the game. Now, a common point of discussion is that these effects of the juiciness in the game improve a game by improving the aesthetic appeal and the perceived usability of a system. And some people also argue that juice can increase a player's competence levels, meaning that their actual ability to play the game might increase because they're getting so much positive feedback. However, there is other research in learning sciences that suggests that all these extra embellishments can actually hurt learning if there's too much distraction. So it seems like there might be kind of a balance, a fine line that we have to draw when we're creating special effects for a video game. So given all of these things, the research questions that I wanted to study were, how do productive design frictions in a casual word game, so this is like the specific type of game I created, influence players' behaviors and experiences, and what kinds of effects on game outcomes do these design frictions have? So what do obstructions and juiciness, like how do they affect a player when they play the game? So these are like my hypotheses that based on the literature that I was reading. So productive obstructions, I thought would lead to more reflective gameplay through microboundaries and all of that discussion that I talked about earlier. And that it might also result in higher game performance, since if you're reflecting on your gameplay, you might get better at the game just by that thought. And then productive juice, I thought would improve the overall player experience and the aesthetic appeal which is kind of the main discussion point that people talk about when they talk about juice. And I also thought that predictive juice would increase higher game performance because there were prior studies that indicated that this might be the case. So the actual game that I created to study this was basically a casual word search game where you have a grid of letters like this. And players just select these letter tiles to form words in any direction, including diagonals and like reverse. And so you can kind of just select the letters in any direction to form a word. And then once you select a word, it gives you a point system, or it gives you points based on the rarity of the word and how long the word is. And then those letters disappear and then new letters fall down. So you keep going until the timer runs out. And then to test my theories, I basically created 7 different versions that had different types of obstructions and juice in them in order to see what those effects would be. So it was basically just a comparison study of how introducing variations on the game affected how players played the game. So this video will kind of show you a bunch of the different features all at once. So it might be a lot to take in at first, but if you kind of just pay attention to one game at a time, you might see a few differences. So the control here is basically with no extra special effects. The productive obstruction here adds a button that you have to click. So it adds an obstruction that slows you down. And then the unproductive obstruction also makes it so that you have to click each letter individually and you can't drag and slide to select. Productive juice adds these extra animations and features where there's like sparkle effects and particle explosions. And the unproductive juice adds a lot of distracting animations and screen shaking so that it might distract the player as they play the game.
So did you had people actually playing this and then?
Yeah, so my study here.
Oh, you're getting right to it.
Yes, I'm getting right to it. So I designed the game, I designed all those versions, and I basically had people play all the different versions of the game, and then I compared the results. That's the short summary, that's the short version of my methodology, which I can go into deeper detail if people are interested, but for the sake of time, I might skip like all of the small details, which if you're interested, I can talk about. But basically I had about 200 people play the game from the App Store. So I actually released the game on the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store, so for Android and iPhones. And I collected the data for over 3 months, and I just had like anonymous game logs that showed the results of all the games. And then I also did like an interview study. So I recruited a few students from UW-Madison from 2 courses. And I had them basically play through all 7 versions. And I asked them questions about the game as they played to try to figure out the mechanisms and what was actually going on inside people's heads as they were playing the game. So the short version of the results, I won't go too deep into all of the numbers, but basically the 2 main differences that I found were that the high rarity, meaning each word, as I mentioned before, when you played a word, was scored based on the rarity of the word, meaning like the frequency of its occurrence in the English language. So like a common word like the would score very low in the game, but a word like, I don't know, what's a more uncommon word? Like, I guess rarity itself is probably more rare than the word the. Rarity, by the sake of being rare, would score higher. And so I had a number that described the rarity of each word. And I found that the productive obstruction version resulted in the highest rarity across all the different versions when people played. So this was a summary of all of the participants who downloaded and played the game.
And that's the one where you had to click that button. That was your extra step,
yeah,
right?
so there's an extra step of pressing the button, and it showed a prompt window that you had to press to play the word. If you notice, the control is also pretty high, but the productive obstruction was actually higher than the control as well. Another, yeah.
It's right there. you're doing that to slow people down. So you're naturally should be able to create longer words or more rare words because you have that extra step
Yeah.
to
So
click
the
your
theory was
lips.
that it would cause people to think about their choice before they play the word.
Yeah.
In addition, we found that the max word length, meaning like the longest word that they ever played, productive obstruction was also the highest for that as well. So going back, you can also see that unproductive obstruction is lower in the high rarity, and the productive juice was also lower in rarity. Whereas this one, almost everything else is about even, except for productive obstruction. I didn't really talk about it before, but I also did versions where I combined the obstructions and the juice just to see if there were any interaction effects, but there didn't really seem to be any interactive effects. Basically, if it had productive obstruction in it, it seemed to kind of take over the effects of the other one. So that's why you see that kind of higher as well. So that was really interesting, and that was good news for me because it meant I could write a dissertation about it. So that was good. And then the results of study 2, this is kind of a detailed chart of when I was analyzing the interviews. You don't have to read all of it, but basically I took a lot of the things and comments that they said and I coded it for what they mentioned in the interviews, depending on what version it was that they were playing. And some of the key highlights that I got from the interviews was that a lot of people playing the productive obstruction version saw that they could change a word after they selected it. So they would choose a word and then they would see that they could, add a letter to the end of it. So that kind of goes along and shows you how productive obstruction led to people playing longer words and more rare words, because typically longer words would, well, this isn't actually really true, but I guess longer words and also kind of automatically led to people playing rare words. And then productive juice, a lot of people felt that the game felt nicer and they liked the aesthetic feel of playing the productive juice version, because whenever they played something successfully, they saw this animation that made them feel like they achieved something. And someone else just kind of generically said that they preferred the productive juice version. Yeah, and this was another person saying that they liked the aesthetic appeal of playing the productive juice version. So these are all kind of different examples showing how productive obstruction worked and showing the aesthetic appeal of productive juice, which I couldn't really get from the quantitative data, but from the qualitative data, it's much easier to see that. So if we revisit the original hypotheses that I was talking about, we have reflective gameplay would come from productive obstructions, higher game performance perhaps from productive obstructions, and that productive juice would lead to overall improved player experience and aesthetic appeal, and that productive juice might result in higher game performance metrics. So let's see how the data supported or didn't support that. So for productive obstructions, we definitely saw that there was more reflective gameplay just based on having that button there. However, there was something interesting in that I originally designed the prompt window so that people would look at the window and see the information on the window and make their decisions based on the rarity and the score that was displayed on the little window. But it turned out most people actually didn't really read the window itself. And just the fact that the button slowed them down and created pausing, that was what actually caused the player behavior to change. So my initial thought of having an explicit prompt that causes players to think, that wasn't really what happened. Instead, it was the mechanisms and the controls of the game that caused them to pause and think about what they were doing. So that was interesting, even if it wasn't exactly in the way that I intended the design to work. Another thing was that productive obstructions would result in higher game performance metrics. And as I showed in the chart, it was correlated with longer words, even though it resulted in fewer words per round, which is interesting. And they were also correlated with higher rarity, as I showed you as well. And then productive juice, improving the overall player experience. That was shown to be true through the interview sessions. So a lot of the players mentioned that it was more satisfying to kind of play the game with all of the extra visual effects. Though I should also note that the unproductive juice version, a lot of people hated it because it seemed it was just too distracting and there's just too many things going on. And then interestingly,
You're gonna keep playing, right? So you're gonna keep playing. You should naturally get better. So if you like the aesthetics, right? You're gonna come back to it and come back to it. So you should
yeah,
get better at it over
that
time.
is true. Yeah.
Like
So
it.
one of the limitations of this part at least was that the interview session, they were only playing each round one time.
Yeah.
So they didn't have a chance to like play it over and over. Though even through the quantitative data, people who played the productive juice version, they did not result in higher game performance actually. So it was only the productive obstruction that results in higher game performance. And I'm not really sure why this was the case, but this leads to more avenues of research studying this, because other people who have studied this, that have studied juice, have shown in other specific cases that if you design a game with the right amount of productive juice, it can actually improve gameplay performance. So my current idea is that it kind of also depends on the game genre or the types of juice that you added to the game, or the quality and the amount of juice that you've added. So it could just be that the types of juice that I added weren't the right ones to increase game performance in my specific game. So that's something to explore further. So given all that, how does this relate back to learning like we were talking about at the beginning? Well, one thing is that, like, as I mentioned, higher gameplay performance in an educational game setting. So if the game itself, if the content is educational, it means that if the player is playing the game well, then they're learning the content better. Also, if you are able to make them use system 2 thinking and do reflective gameplay more, then that means that they might be more conscious of what they're doing. And reflection is an important part of education, so that might also lead to better learning while they're playing. And then these are just some kind of specific limitations to my study, is that the quantitative study was anonymous, so there was no connection to demographic information, but so I couldn't do any additional analysis onto how it relates to the demographics of the people who played. But that was just authentic to how games are played online, since most games are anonymous, and it was easier to do the study this way so that more people could play the game without sharing their private information. Also, in the future, I want to study the effects of audio on the game, which I included audio effects into the game as well, except that there was actually no way to log whether or not players had their devices on silent or if they had turned off the audio effects. And so it was challenging to make any concrete conclusions on the effects of audio because I didn't know if players had the audio on or off. So that could be a future thing to study as well. And like I mentioned before, this was a specific style of game. It was like a word search game. It was a mobile casual game, but there are lots of different types of video games. And whether or not the outcomes that I found in this study apply to other genres is an open question. And so we could try studying this in other types of games as well. So
is there also opportunity for some longer term study where you would know who the participants were so that you could track some of those demographics and understand the sound or other preferences, or maybe track them over, much longer a period of time to see what the results could be?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, along a longitudinal study, given a longer period of time to study participants who play the game over and over, that would definitely be an interesting study as well. Yeah. Because this one, the maximum amount of time that anyone played was about 3 months. So that would definitely be interesting to see more people play it for longer periods of time.
Yeah.
So these conclusions just about using the minimal amount of obstructions necessary to achieve your goals. provide alternative pathways for the player using obstructions for best results, and don't overuse juice. Because if you have too much distracting juice, people will also perform worse and not like the game. These conclusions, I kind of skipped over a lot of the details of my study that lead to these conclusions, but these are still things that we learned from my study. So yeah, like you mentioned, future work expanding on the demographics and increasing the time that people play, and also focusing on the audio effects and different genres of games as well. So yeah, that concludes my presentation. Are there any questions or comments that people want to share?
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, you have a question for Dr. Sung, you can put it right in the Q&A function for us. The first question I would have, and this will give people time to type in their own questions as well if you have some, is how are you using this kind of research and work with our students here on campus? And how are you using it as a teaching mechanism in data and computer science?
Yeah, so one of the summer projects I'm working on is actually creating an educational algebra game with 4 students this summer, 4 computer science students. And I'm working on it with a math professor colleague, Professor Erin Monroe Kroll. So we've been working on this project since last summer. So yeah, a lot of the things we talk about are, the game design aspects of how to make the game not just fun but also educational. So there are a lot of like small decisions we have to make in the game to just try to optimize the learning capabilities and also make sure we include all the content. So
Right.
Yeah.
And then what about in a class, if you're teaching intro to programming or video game development, how does this kind of work fit into that? Not just on the research side, but when you're really teaching students information from the ground up?
Yeah, so I think a lot of this kind of thought about how to design a game, I think it comes into play whether or not you're just designing a game for fun or whether you're trying to design an educational game. Because things like Juice, that applies even if it's not an educational game.
Right. Yep.
Because to improve like the player experience and to make the game more visually appealing and things like that, it's always important to include like animations and special effects and things like that. So in my video game development class, we would talk about like game design issues and things like that. Intro programming, I don't really talk about game development or game design like explicitly, but I do have final projects for that class. And a lot of times students just are self-motivated to do a game as a project. So that's a common final project topic. And so that's
Yeah, you find a lot
that.
of students are interested in the video game aspect or the design piece, particularly. Like they might be interested in programming or data science, but the video game piece is maybe what first gets them a little excited about.
Yeah, when I present them with final project ideas, usually a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people are drawn to video games just because, people like to play video games, they grew up with video games,
Yep.
and they've always enjoyed the idea of trying to implement their own video game. So once you take intro to programming, you do have the skills to like create a simple video game. And so it can be fun to work on in that class.
Right. Very nice. Why did you pick specifically like the casual word search kind of game as opposed to another kind of game when you were thinking about this project and, trying to understand the methodology?
Yeah, so the reason why I chose a casual mobile game is that I wanted to choose a game that was very accessible and like inclusive of all types of people and all players, because kind of stereotypically, and there's a lot of papers and like talk about, certain types of video games attract a lot of male video game players, for instance, especially if they have like graphic violence or things like that. And so I wanted to choose a game style and a game genre that was more appealing to a wider range of audiences. And so like a casual mobile game is something that a lot of people don't think about as being a video game, even though it is technically a video game in all senses of the word. And so a lot of people like of wider demographics, like wide age range, all genders and like things like that, like to have like fun, just casual
Right.
games on their
Something to do to
phone,
pass the
something to
time
do to
or.
pass the time while they're like, waiting for something to happen, or,
Mhm.
so it's very common for people to have these little mini games on their
Yep.
phone. And so
Sure.
I thought that was a great, like, accessible, open-ended game that a lot of people could relate to.
Right. Yeah, that makes total sense. And it almost seems it's maybe an easier start in the sense of, it's an easy thing to understand. Some of the other kinds of games might be too involved where you couldn't really narrow down the specific influences or conclusions that you could make. Do you I guess I don't know, I'm not a big video game person. We had, Nintendo when we were kids, of course, but I never got into video games in that way. And do you see, as right, technology has greatly impacted how video games function? Do you see that um, that there are more and more educational games being made? It's not just, I feel like games used to be just for fun in some level, right?
Yeah.
What's been the evolution of, fun or just for entertainment versus actually like learning things, even if players don't know they're learning learning things?
Yeah, so there's a lot of interesting things. Like, not only are educational games becoming more common and being used more widely in the educational system. So I think there was like a recent survey done where they asked like K-8 teachers, so like kindergarten to 8th grade teachers, they asked them if they used a video game in their classroom curriculum at
Mhm.
all. And I think about like 3/4 of them said yes, they use them maybe at least once a month in their classroom. So people are starting to see the benefits of having a motivational item such as a video game to use in their classrooms. But then not only that, there's also research studies that show that video games that people just play for fun can have side effects of being educational. For example, they found that people who struggled with literacy and reading skills, if they played a game that that had a storyline, or if they played a game that had a lot of text and reading that they had to do,
Mhm.
they would actually increase their literacy skills just because they were so involved in playing the game and needing to read in order to play the game.
And it
So
doesn't
there's
feel like an assignment, if you will. If you're playing a game, you're going to read it because it's in the game. You're not practicing reading, even if
right,
you are. Yeah, it feels
right.
different.
So these kinds of like hidden components to video games sometimes led to learning skills, even if that wasn't the intention of the video game.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I like that. Um, and then what about, the non-educational games where, right, excessive violence and where people maybe are playing too much, or the, teenagers or young adults or adults even that are addicted to a game? Does this happen? Is this a real thing?
Yeah, that's a big topic of controversy, especially among researchers who like study video games,
Yeah.
and like psychologists and people in their respective fields. Like, some people categorize video game addiction as a thing, as a separate thing.
Okay.
Other people kind of criticize that by saying, sure, people might be addicted to video games, but kind of labeling it as its own thing is kind of misleading, because people can also be addicted to shopping. They can be addicted to like gambling. They can be addicted to other things. It's more of like a nature of addiction and not really the medium itself.
Okay.
That's the problem. And then also people who try to link like video game violence with real world violence. There's a lot of people and there's a lot of research out there that kind of link the two things together,
Mhm.
but it's still hotly debated, and it's kind of up in the air as to whether or not it's a causal relationship, meaning if video games with violence and people who play a lot of video games with violence, if the video games itself is causing like
Right.
more violent acts and aggression, or if it's just the fact that people who are already innately led to violence are attracted to those video games because it's an outlet for them. And
Right.
so it's kind of hard to find the line there.
And then, you're working on the positive side of video gaming, right, as an educational component. So how do you make sure that the work you're doing is not playing into those negative stereotypes or really showing the benefits, right? When people do have such hard feelings about a video game addiction or violence or some of those other pieces, how do you take the good work that you're doing in the education sector and say, no, like there is positivity here and these are the benefits, and how do you frame that for folks?
Yeah, I think it always depends on like who you're talking to, because there are always people who are more skeptical and maybe, you know, don't play video games themselves and may not, you know, want to see the positive side of video games. So I think it just depends on who I'm talking to. And if I'm talking to someone who's skeptical, I'll try to make those, you know, arguments from the science side of things and say, you know, it's not black and white. Video games aren't like good or bad. It's how you use them. It's whether you use them in moderation. And there's no real, like, it's hard to find direct causal links between like playing certain types of video games and leading to aggression and like acts of violence and things like that. And so, yeah, I think just knowing that there are definitely like ways that video games can be good means that we should try to move in that direction and focus on those things. And in other ways, like with like people who might play video games too much and that might cause problems in their life, like, you know, that I think that goes with everything. Just in moderation, things can be better. And if you do struggle with playing too much video games in all your time, then, you know, people can struggle with that kind of thing for lots of different things. And it's just a matter of working on that. That doesn't mean that video games can't also be good. Perfect.
That makes total sense. Well, I want to thank you for your time today, Dr. Sung. We have kind of gotten through all the questions we've had, and definitely look forward to our next conversation about video games and future Our Connections webinars, where we can connect with our faculty and others around campus and continue to spread the good word on things that are happening here with our students and our faculty, researchers, and information to spread the good word. So I appreciate your time and look forward to the next time we can chat.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yep, you bet. Have a good day, everyone. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.